Tanse, kisha supernanitsikatson, niskuchiskaigan chinia, the Machifnia. Tawao, welcome everyone to the latest in the åhpin'toyahk series, We Help Each Other Up, which is organized by the Arts Working Group on Indigenous Initiatives here in the Faculty of Arts, of which I'm co-chair. I'm Keisha Supernant, and I'm proud to be here to be your host today to introduce the conversation that we're about to experience. I'm currently located, and the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta is also located on Treaty 6 territory in the Métis homeland, here in what is known in Cree as Amiskouti or Amiskouti-Waskahikan. This is a place where a lot of Indigenous nations have come together over time immemorial. It's been a gathering place and remains a gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples. The University of Alberta is situated on these lands and is working to learn to be a better relation in being on these territories. And this work that we're here today to engage in is part of that ongoing process and journey. So the åhpin'toyahk series is really about conversation. This is the third in a series organized and generously funded by the Cool Institute for Advanced Study and Edmonton Heritage Council Fire Grant. And we're delighted to have two amazing scholars and artists with us today. So our host is Tanya Harnett, who is a member of Carry the Kettle First Nation in Saskatchewan, a renowned artist. We are lucky to have her here as an associate professor in the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. She works across many different media to bring forward Indigenous stories and histories, including the impacts of residential schools on our communities. She is in conversation today with Billy-Ray Belcourt, a distinguished writer and scholar from Driftpile Cree Nation. He has a long list of significant accomplishments, from being the first First Nations Rhodes Scholar in Canada to being a Trudeau Foundation Scholar and winning the Governor General's Gold Medal for his PhD, which he completed here in the Department of English and Film Studies in the Faculty of Arts in 2020. So we're really happy to welcome him back. His two books of poetry and highly regarded memoir have received many accolades, firmly establishing Billy-Ray as a powerful Indigenous voice. Just yesterday, he received the Alumni Horizon Award from the University of Alberta. So please join me in welcoming these two inspiring colleagues for our conversation today.
Good day, Billy-Ray. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Very happy to see you yesterday. It's good to see your face all the time. So welcome back to the welcome back to the U of A in a little bit of a virtual world. Can you tell me where you are right now?
Yeah, so I'm in Vancouver, which is unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I
had the privilege and honor sitting on the examining committee of your dissertation. It was a real honor and a joy. And so I was geeking out when I was asked. I'm like, no way, I get to do this. So I had a little bit of fandom happening. But I have your dissertation right here.
Oh my goodness.
There's something that I wanted to talk to you about that I didn't hear too much. We didn't discuss too much. And I can't remember, I just made note of it, about how many times you said love. It's not in the title. Your title is Conspiracy of Indian Joy, Essays on Violence, Care, and Possibility. It's so profound in that work, the word love. Before we start talking about the hard stuff, the joy and the celebration of the word love.
Mm-hmm. 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 Perhaps if I were to render it an equation, it'd be care plus possibility equals love, something to that effect. I think of love both as a set of practices, how we care for one another against the embargo on care that is colonization. But I also think of it as, in the words of the late queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz, as a kind of forward dawning futurity. It's something that pulls at us from the future, I think. And decolonial love in particular is what I'm interested in. So the ways that love operates as a force in the world in contradistinction to its coloniality. And of course, how I think about love begins with my kukum, who raised me. And I remember discussing this in the dissertation examination and crying as I was doing so. But I think that she did and continues to do is, raise Cree kids in a way that protects them. And I think that has deep sociological significance. And of course, she may not conceptualize her style of care that way. I think that's absolutely what's happening, especially when you're raising Cree kids in rural northern Alberta, where the landscape is really saturated with the history of dispossession and abduction and all that.
How do you find joy too? I mean, we have such a hard history, and that's something we share. It's almost something we don't verbalize. I mean, there's many times we can be walking down the street and we can see that pain in other people's eyes, and you don't even have to talk about it. That's usually the way we go. It's automatically thinking about, the systemic traumas, and to push through that component is not really an easy thing. So you've given hope to a lot of people, not soft skilling it. I'm wondering how you see love from a colonial context. How is it? How is the white people embracing the idea of love in your work, or is it a bridge that's easy for them to cross?
I think something that's difficult for some readers to comprehend is that love can be a site of both constitution and severance. So that's Judith Butler's language, and language I've found very useful. In the dissertation, in my memoir, out of the dissertation, I just discussed the various ways that love, when it's corrupted by the logics of colonialism, is damaging and reinforces damaging narratives about Indigenous life, and can emerge out of fetishization. I always say colonization is an event that's also it's an event of marginalization that's also erotic. There's an erotic component to colonization. Indigenous feminists have been making that argument for decades now. And so it's not so much simply about love as a fundamentally reparative force in the world. That line of thinking is sometimes troubling or difficult.
Yeah, the erotic seems placed in the exotic, and you're starting to go into places where it almost puts you as subject, and that's a tough place to be.
Yeah,
that's a tough place to be, and it's so brave. Can you tell me how you got there?
I get asked a question of this sort often, and I suppose it never occurred to me that what I was doing was exposing myself, so to speak. I had a natural inclination, I think, to theorize autobiographically. That's probably why I was compelled to study, say, women and gender studies, and then to do the PhD in English. Maybe like a generational, it's like coded into my personhood as someone who was born at a particular time in the history of the world where you're performing your sense of self all the time.
I think our viewers might not know exactly quite where we're coming from about a personal narrative. And at the time I'm reading your dissertation, I'm going through things with my son where he's dealing with identity, and I was co-relating how he's dealing with his identity as being a gay man. And it helped me to understand what he was going through. So it was very a blessing to me, what you were talking about. And it's difficult. Maybe people haven't read your work. Some would, of course, but how can you frame that when people haven't read your work?
Well, firstly, my mom actually was very touched by your comments about your own son, and I never mentioned that. She was listening in. In the dissertation, I begin with my parents, my brother and I, who are twins, our birth. And then it's a chronological examination, I suppose, of my life to the present. And the core of that project is about how to conceptualize queer Indigenous life using the analytical tools from Indigenous studies, feminist theory, queer theory, in a way that did not further entrench my indurability, but rather brought into focus the sort of radical possibility that I think inheres at the nexus of those sets of identities. In a way, I think the work is autobiographical because I'm trying to, bring myself into being as much as I'm trying to write a dissertation or write a book. I was just discussing, I brought up Jose Esteban Munoz again. The sort of iconic phrase in Cruising Utopia, his second book, that, queerness is an ideality that's not yet here, but rather arrives to us in a futuristic form. I had the epiphany that kind of line of thinking, saved me in a way. It rescued me in a way from the history of marginalization and pathologization that meant that certain narratives of queer Indigenous life were available to me and others weren't.
I'm thinking about home and home for you. Can you talk a little bit about the distance? I mean, it's not a long time to get from Driftpile to Edmonton.
Right.
But it seems like forever to get to where you've been. Can you, I remember myself, because it's an impossible thing. It feels like an impossible thing. Like, how do you get into the academy? How do you make that system work? That's a whole can of worms. And how did you go on your journey? We're sitting in U of A right now in this territory. Can you talk about that distance psychologically?
I stumbled into everything, I think. As a teenager, I flourished academically, so it made sense that I would pursue post-secondary education. I applied only to the U of A for my undergrad. I had no interest in going elsewhere. I wanted to be, near my community. And Edmonton was a place that we had visited often. And that first term, I wanted to drop out so bad. And I drove the 3.5 hours, one way every weekend for that first term. And even during blizzards, and I had a little red car with winter tires, thankfully, doing my best. But it was shortly thereafter that it occurred to me that what I didn't want to do was become a teacher or a lawyer. Those were the things that seemed available to me. but rather that I loved ideas and I loved books and I loved reading and I loved thinking. And that thinking was an activity that I could pursue a kind of life with, so that I could make a shape of a life with thinking. In my comparative literature courses, I realized that I could study the literature of people who also experience various forms of oppression, and it didn't have to revolve around the English canon. And that also was very empowering to discover. I think what mattered in those years was the support of my community and my family. And I had a few relatives who had done post-secondary education, and they inspired me tremendously.
So can you talk about how you went from your undergrad, and what did you do socially on campus? Because it's hard to find place for being an Indian and in campus. How did you fit yourself into that sort of community? Because I know you created community.
So in my second year, I got involved with the Aboriginal Student Council, and that, I think, really shaped my time at the U of A. And the subsequent years after that, I was its president. And being able to have a kind of leadership to advocate on behalf of Indigenous students, that felt incredibly important to me. And I remember sitting, in various boardrooms with, powerful people, and being the only student in the room, and speaking with a lot of bravery and honesty, and so much so that as a faculty member now at a university, I sort of even marvel at my own spunk and in my spirit as an undergrad. At the time, I felt that so much decisions about Indigenous students were being made without our input, or with at tables where we were absent.
Yeah.
And I knew that these decisions had incredibly immediate implications for our academic success, our social lives on campus. It has a new name now, I believe, the Aboriginal Student Services Center. I think they were a huge force of good in my life and on campus, and I think the ladies there, I think about them still a lot.
I teach in the power plant in the drawing area, but from that space, it's very odd, because being up there, nobody knows what's downstairs. Nobody knows what's going on in the corner. It's something that's just something that's indigenous, and so, or Aboriginal, whatever you want to call the flavor of the month for the term. How did that feel absent in that sort of corner in people's minds? It seems like
I remember thinking that the power plant was haunted. Do you feel that way?
It is.
Yeah. I have some spooky stories, definitely, from my 3 years there.
You get to love that building.
It did feel like we were somehow in the middle of campus, but also invisible to everybody. And maybe there's a certain kind of possibility that's made available to us because of that.
Yeah.
We governed ourselves, essentially. We were autonomous. I decided to move away from the student group model, which in that model, student groups were essentially subordinate to student council, or from the general student union. So I moved away from that model. I thought we could govern ourselves. We could be a space for both intellectual and social and extracurricular support. And I think we were that.
I keep thinking about students who are coming in and always making pathways, because
Mhm.
those pathways, the opening doors is really hard. I often feel like decisions are being made for me because I'm indigenous. People are talking about. Have you felt that way too, that you're the object of discussion?
Maybe even so much so that it's like normalized, or that I'm not always alert to it. Can you say a bit more though?
Well, I'm just thinking that it's almost like a fetishizing of what it means to have. Still, there's not very many First Nations people in the university, and it seems like a push to go through. I'm thinking about our students who are following behind us.
I realized that in the entirety of my undergraduate degree, I believe I only took one class with an Indigenous person, an Indigenous prof. No, two classes. And I think about at UBC, where there's me in creative writing, there's Dallas Hunt in English, and a lot of my students will have taken both his class and my class, and I think of how important and special that is, and how a kind of community can build around there, in your classrooms with your Indigenous professors, and also that it suggests a possible life in the university for Indigenous students if they so choose to take that route.
If we're going further down your education trail, you ended up going Rhodes Scholar. Can you tell me about that?
I think about that time in the UK with a great deal of ambivalence, truthfully, because I was in the heart of the colonial knowledge project. I felt invisible. I felt like a ghost. I used to joke that I was a ghost roaming the streets of Oxford, and experienced various kinds of racism there and microaggressions on a regular basis. It occurred to me that I had to be in Canada while I was there. What mattered to me was that I was working in concert with Indigenous people, with my community, with other Indigenous communities. That the work that I wanted to do had to take those communities into account. It had to be done in alongside those communities. So, I could have been there for 2 years. I chose to only stay for one, and then return to the U of A.
Some of the events that you and I had, and you haven't really talked about it. I went to your reserve, and I was looking at the water series that they did. And thank you. I don't know if I ever thanked you. Thank you for writing on that. This exchange we've had about the work, but we've never ever spoke about. I'm wondering how you felt about that image, because I feel like I stepped onto your reserve, although I was talking to one of your counselors. I'm thinking about how that all came into environmental violence, and how violence has, I'm just going around that idea of environments and violence and in the human body and the social body.
Important about that series that you did was that it rendered the kinds of invisibilized violence that mire the lives of Indigenous people and communities. So much of the human cost of colonization is borne invisibly. So I think of like the way that our cells, how our bodies are very much still, burdened by the various atrocities of the 20th century, lower life expectancies in the prairies. These are all things that can be measured, but they aren't always. but they're not necessarily spectacular. The work of showing how bodies of water also bear a kind of violence and representing their woundedness is important too.
Your reserve is right down from Swan Hills.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have lived with that your whole life. How do you feel about that? And your family is still there.
Yeah.
That's an everyday thought with you about that. And it's home, right? It's home.
It wasn't until I was, when NASA was at UBC in 2016, I think, 2017, Dallas Hunt gave a talk on the history of the Swan Hills treatment plant and the incredibly racialized set of decisions that landed it there. So in the imagination of those who oversee the plant, Indigenous life, animal life, these things are all expendable and in the interest of industry. And we've already seen how the kinds of contamination that animal life is that is accruing in animals, in deer, etc. And whenever I hear of a string of cancer diagnoses on my reserve, I always think these are sociological problems as much as they are biological ones. But there's no discourse available in the community for people to make those claims, and I think that's brutal.
Do you associate the violence and on the land, on the body of your reserve, to your violence that you discuss in your dissertation? What's the connection?
I would think so. I think of like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network did a lot of organizing around that formulation, balance to the land, balance to the body. And so I think of it as like an Indigenous feminist framework that takes seriously the interconnectedness of all kinds of life and by extension, all kinds of violence. In my current writing, I'm interested perhaps more directly in how Northern Alberta is a particular site for the instantiation of particular kinds of colonial policy. So the ways that the peripheries of modern life bear a particular burden in order for Canada to continue to come into existence. And part of that to me is epistemological, which is to say that certain kinds of knowledge are made unthinkable in certain places. What does it take for a community to sort of be roused into awareness of their subjugation? Interestingly, I've noticed over the last few years how my community, Driftpile, in the wake of various really spectacularized forms of violence, so the deaths of Indigenous teens, the ongoing discovery of or locating of graves on residential school sites, how that has allowed for a particular kind of consciousness to emerge, where folks are now starting to speak in a politicized way and to leverage a plural modality of voice. And I think that inevitably will lead to a frame of mind or a lens where we can say that the cancer rates on reserves are very much of a piece with the ongoing colonial project.
I really appreciate looking at the world from your eyes, because you have new glasses, new lenses that not everybody has seen through. It's original, and it's a very exciting direction. And we're lucky to have you in our lives. Yeah, it's really original and true, hard ass, and true. If anybody here hasn't read any of Billy-Ray's work, I strongly recommend you picking up some of his writing. He's now published quite a bit now, and continues to be working very hard, just completely out of passion. And it's lovely to see. Okay. Are you a morning or night person?
Night.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Dogs or cats?
Dogs, I think.
Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate.
What's your favorite word?
The first word that's come to my mind is cacophony.
Cacophony. What's your least favorite word? What's your favorite cuss word?
Probably the F word.
Yep. You couldn't say it, hey? Flying or driving?
Driving, unless it's a long period of time.
Cheesies or beef jerky?
Oh my goodness. Cheesies, I think.
This is a road trip. I need Indian thing. We're gonna go for a road trip. What are you gonna get?
Cheesies.
London or New York?
I've only been to London, but I'll say New York.
Okay. What turns you on?
Just generally? I don't know how to answer this question. Read my books to find out, I guess.
Okay. What turns you off?
Racism.
Yeah. What's your favorite sound?
Sound? Say my cookum's voice.
What's your least favorite sound?
An alarm.
KFC?
Yes. Guiltily so.
It's an Indian joke, the KFC joke. Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. If anybody doesn't know, I got most of those from the Actors Studio, those questions, and they got it from someplace else. So it's nice to hear those answers. Get to know you a little bit more.
I love the rapid fire questions. Although sometimes they take you aback. You're like, I don't know. Thank both of you for that really engaging conversation. And of course, a lot of the things that you bring up are hit home for me as well. I've been spending quite a bit of time up around your nation there, Billy-Ray, and will continue to do so. And I got a lot of family connections up in there. Just found out there's a bunch of Supernants in Sucker Creek that I'm related to. And it's a really powerful part of the world, I find, going there, and really a lot of sense of coming home. I guess the only thing I might have is a bit of a wonder. I think one of the so coming back to where we started, the role of sort of joy and love. And I find so much still, especially in these academic spaces, there's a tendency to focus on how we're somehow broken as Indigenous peoples and communities. And I guess, if you had something to say to folks who are watching or are listening or are thinking about this, how do we encourage people to stop thinking about us as broken, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to really start thinking about our futures and our desires and our love and our hopes, as opposed to all the things that have been done to us, right? What would you say to people who are listening about that?
Spend time in a room where there are several Indigenous people. I feel like the first way that we interact with each other is through laughter. I think that experiential knowledge of our joy can combat that kind of grammar of deficiency. Go to a reading, of an Indigenous writer's reading, and you'll see that for sure.
Yeah, or walk down the halls of Native Studies and just hear the laughter
Exactly.
echoing down the hallway.
Yeah.
We spent more time in the hallway laughing in Native Studies than anything else.
I'm just again wanting to thank everyone who was involved in putting this series together. This is the final planned Ухпиниντуяᕽ for the spring of 2022, but we are in conversations about continuing this series into the fall. So please keep an eye and an ear out for future events. I want to thank the members of the Arts Working Group on Indigenous Initiatives, and especially our community elders in helping to guide this process, our funders, KIES and the Fire Grant. And I also want to have a shout out to the arts events team who's been supporting us behind the scenes and really making sure that everything runs smoothly. Your labor is always valued in these types of events. And to everyone participating and watching, I wish you the best of the rest of your day in this beautiful, at least in Edmonton, a beautiful spring-like day as the light continues to return. And so safe travels wherever you may be going, and hi.